So today's topic is intentional resilience. We're going to take a look at, I'm going to put this in the context of the relational worldview. So we'll revisit the concepts involved there. We'll also take a look at the differences between stress and trauma and how they relate to one another. And we'll take a look at some definitions of different kinds of trauma that we deal with. And finally, taking a look at how do we use the four quadrants of the relational worldview to develop strategies for intentional resilience. So to begin with, I want to just look at the terms. So as we all know, intentional means you do it on purpose. And resilience is the capacity to bounce back, to have some toughness. The idea of putting this together as an intentional resilience is to plan and engage in holistic, personalized strategies that promote balance and mitigate the negative impacts of adversity. And we certainly all have had our practice recently with regard to dealing with diversity. The relational worldview is an indigenous approach to understanding health and well-being, as opposed to the linear worldview of the mainstream Western world. The relational world understands health and wellness in a four-quadrant circle. It's a composite of many indigenous teachings, including the medicine wheel, though it's not intended to depict the medicine wheel. Many different tribes have teachings that speak of our experience of the world as in a circle or a cyclical, and it is so what we've done at the National Indian Child Welfare Association is to use a composite of indigenous teachings to help us develop a guide to our own practice of helping both individuals as well as helping communities, and we apply that to our own social work practice. This relational worldview is represented by a four-quadrant circle of mind, body, spirit, and context. In that context quadrant are things like culture and community and peers and work and economics and our social history. And these are just representative examples, because all of existence, or all of the world around us, is included here. In the mind quadrant, things like knowledge and judgment and thinking, our thought processes, things like self-esteem and our memories and emotions. And again, these are both thoughts and feelings, both cognitive and emotional processes in this mind quadrant, and I can only list representative examples here. In the body, our biochemistry, genetics, health status, rest, sleep, substance use and abuse. And again, just examples, because all of our the things in our physical well-being, our physical balance is here in this quadrant. And then in the spirit quadrant, I include what I call the innate positive and the innate negative, the learned positive and the learned negative. This is my understanding of the teachings that I have acquired through my lifetime. I think of the learned positives as those things that we learn to do that evoke positive spiritual outcomes: prayer, ritual, ceremony, sacred songs, These are things that put us in touch with our positive spiritual entities and bring about positive outcomes for us. The learned negatives are those things that we learn to do that bother us. We say what goes around comes around. So if we put out negative things, it often comes back to us. Things like gossip or jealousy or coveting what other people have. These tend to show up in different religions as the things we shouldn't do. So thou shalt not list. The innate positive are those things that help us no matter what it is that we believe or how we conceptualize them. They're thought of very differently in different cultures, or whether people have a religious or spiritual discipline that they follow. Some may think of these things as good luck, or but others may think of them as positive karma, or as ancestral intervention, or guidance from spirit guides, or from the angelic forces, or the Christ-like. These are things that are greater than our understanding, and they influence us positively. And the innate negative is just the opposite, the things that bother us, no matter what we believe. And we have different ways to understand these negative things. Bad things happen to good people. The bad luck, misfortune, or negative spirits, or these can be understood in many different ways. But life is understood as a balance across these four quadrants. Life, these four quadrants are fluid, and there's a cyclical nature to them. Every aspect of life is related to every other aspect. Nothing can change in any one of the quadrants without all other quadrants being impacted. So you're in constant flux all of the time. We're not the same person at 7 o'clock in the morning as we are at 11 o'clock in the morning or at 4 in the afternoon. We're probably in different contexts or doing different activities. So our mind shifts, our body changes. So and the idea is that it is our nature to be in balance, to come in and out of balance. When we think of it from biological terms as homeostasis. When we're hungry, we eat. When we're cold, we put on a sweater or get to someplace warm. So we're always constantly adjusting this in different ways. And from the sense of our practice in helping people, services don't have to be aimed at the problem. They're aimed at restoring balance. That interventions aren't necessarily directed at symptoms, but rather aimed at bringing about a stronger balance across the four quadrants. And so we ask the question, not what's wrong with you, but how can balance be restored? So I'd like to take a minute to pause here. I know that that all of you, in some way or another, have either heard me talk about this or are familiar with these concepts. So I'd like to ask you to, using these four quadrants, assess your own state of balance at the moment. How are you doing? And think about two different places that you will be during the day. And many of us are in our homes working. But if we get to if we get to go outside to take a walk, that's going to change your context. So think about it, and I think we're going to unmute at the moment, and I'd like to hear some people's comments, thoughts about this.
Thanks, Terry. Unfortunately, folks won't be able to unmute at this time, but
Okay.
go ahead and use the chat box. And I've just put instructions on how to use the chat. So just make sure everyone you're chatting to all participants so everyone can see your message. So yeah, go ahead and give us your thoughts in the chat box. Thank you.
So if we have some examples, that would be great. I can.
All right, we have a couple comments coming in, and Terry, I'm happy to read those for you.
Yes, please. I can't see them actually.
Sure. So Deborah says, I'm doing okay. Sarah Whitman says, the status of each of the 4 quadrants changed directly with my change of environment. For instance, taking a walk, meditating, virtually chatting with friends. Tia says, a little worried about the health of my family during this time. Susan says, I am calm, satiated, working this morning, hoping to take a hike this afternoon. Deborah says, my mind is present, spirit restless.
Thank you. Anything anybody else wants to share? Okay. Well, we'll have a chance to think more about this. These, as I said, these quadrants, our balance around the quadrants change all of the time. So we are constantly in a state of shift and change. But we can, you can let this happen to you. In other words, it's always going to operate, or we can get intentional about it. We can actually intentionally shift the balance. We do it all the time, and we do it naturally. As I said, when we're hungry, we eat. When we're cold, we put on a sweater. When we need social activity, we call up someone or we talk to someone. And these are, so this is a natural process that we can get much more intentional about. So adversity, it's important to point out, adversity is a normal part of life. And we are built to find balance. However, the greater the stress, the more intentional we have to be. And we're at a time now with the pandemic that adversity is with us all of the time. The stresses are growing, and they're coming from multiple directions. But we have tribal teachings and traditions and practices that are full of intentional strategies to promote balances. And we're going to explore what some of those are as we go along today. This way of thinking, I want to put it in the context of how we experience stress and the difference between experiencing stress and experiencing trauma, and then how do we link those two things together. So stress is a state of mental or emotional strain or tension that's resulting from demanding circumstances or adversity. So we all experience stress in different ways at different times. The trauma is a deeply disturbing or distressing experience, usually has the element of some kind of emotional shock, like a sense of betrayal or a sense of deep loss. But if we put those two concepts together, traumatic stress is mental, emotional strain resulting from severely adverse experiences. So it's chronic and ongoing. This stress can become traumatic when it's unmitigated and unmanaged. In other words, when we don't do anything about it, when we experience it, or when we don't have a plan to take care of it. It can become traumatic when it's chronic, when it's oppressive, or when it's dehumanizing, and when it attacks our very core of our being. Stress can become traumatic when it's internalized and it becomes toxic to relationships and our health and our spiritual well-being. Several months ago, I had an opportunity to interview several elders about historic trauma. And one of the elders had been to a healing workshop and to learn about historic trauma. And in the course of our conversation, she said, you know, I had so much pain in my heart that it would swell up my throat and pour out my mouth in ugly words. And I didn't even know that was my trauma talking. And she went on to say, I hurt so many people in my family. And now I'm doing what I need to do to restore those relationships and heal those relationships that I damaged so badly in the past. So this idea that we can internalize this stress that becomes traumatic, and then can become toxic to relationships. It's also, stress can become traumatic when it triggers historic trauma, or when it triggers personal unresolved grief, loss. The other thing that I have added to this list since the pandemic began is when it's collective. And we know this in our tribal communities, that when stress is collective and when trauma is collective, it becomes traumatic. In other words, a whole group of people, all of us across the entire world, are in the same adverse situation at the moment. And it is this increases the level of stress because there's a lack of any safe haven to turn to at a time when everybody's under the same threat, the same assault. So let's talk just a little bit about the different types of trauma that we're talking about. I mentioned historical trauma. Intergenerational traumas, when historical trauma is handed down generation to generation, it's handed down in many different ways, but the idea that it's unresolved, and it's an unresolved sense of loss that transcends the different multiple generations. We can experience current trauma. Many people at this point are experiencing the trauma of loss of a loved one, or loss of friendships, loss of the activities. So we are all having some experiencing this notion of current trauma. Trauma can be complex. It can be when it's layered on top of trauma on top of trauma. It can become complex and difficult to even sort out where the feelings are coming from. We can have experience trauma as very personal, as being a victim of violence or sexual assault or emotional abuse or bullying or separation. These are all the types of trauma that are that severe adverse experience we have personally. But we can also experience trauma as a bystander, witnessing violence or seeing something horrible happen to someone else, or seeing um, the the traumatic experience in front of us. Um, Chronic trauma is I've heard described as like the drip 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 of a leaking faucet that will is so adverse to one's well-being that it depletes the energy. So it's poverty, discrimination, racism, and many different chronic. These are the what seem to be in any one moment the small stresses that unmitigated become traumatic. And the topic I want to go on to next is the last item on this list, and that's secondary trauma, or sometimes referred to as vicarious trauma. And the symptoms of and situations that might bring about secondary trauma, secondary traumatic stress, STS. If you have a death of a child or a parent on your caseload, or where you're the helper and you lose someone, this is a big trigger for secondary traumatic stress. When we're counseling victims of abuse, where we're constantly hearing repeated accounts of loss, or if, say you're a first responder, or if you're investigating child abuse and you're constantly seeing photos of victims, these can be in that category of secondary traumatic stress. One that we don't think of very often is the idea of being verbally assaulted. Someone who has a traumatic trauma background can take those feelings that toxicity comes out on us as helpers. So if you get verbally assaulted by someone when you're trying to help, that's another inducer of secondary traumatic stress. Unfortunately, secondary traumatic stress, if we don't work with it, if we don't deal with it, it can move into workplace trauma. It can turn into the lateral oppression or violence between people in the workplace and the helpers, and we see it in the form of cynicism or negative attitudes or conflict between people, and it can erupt into to anger and rage, or might be seen in the form of withdrawal. And sometimes people take that workplace trauma and turn it inward, and by an absenteeism, not coming to work, or not seeing their families that they're working with because they just simply don't have the energy to be able to do this. These are all related symptoms that make intentional resilience a really important concept. Often we hear the idea of self-care, and at NICWA we created this presentation and this notion of intentional resilience to move beyond the idea of self-care, that we know that that adversity exists in the world, and it exists in the work that we do, and we have to be very planful about how we deal with this issue of secondary traumatic stress. I want to next do an exercise, and you have before you. This is a big long slide, so I'm going to read it, and it's a story of a young man in his early 20s. He's homeless. He couch surfs from home to home with relatives and friends. He's staying at his sister's home, where he has 3 nephews, ranging from 6 to 13 years old. And his name is Richard. Richard lost both parents in a substance abuse related murder-suicide when he was only 11 years old. And he spent 6 years in non-native foster care. Richard suffers from bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and occasionally binge drinks. Richard receives services from the Tribal Vocational Rehabilitation Program, where he recently had an employment opportunity, and after receiving his first paycheck, Richard went to the local casino and won $1,500, and that same evening he went out to celebrate and came home drunk and beat up his eldest nephew. The nephew had physical injuries requiring hospitalization. Richard's now in jail where his bipolar symptoms have become acute. And Richard's counselor is the adult child of alcoholics, a survivor of physical abuse himself. And he was recently cussed out and threatened by Richard. I want you to think about Richard's situation and use the chat box. What types of trauma do you hear in Richard's story? And I'm going to leave his story up there. We've just been through a list of the types of trauma, so I want you to take a look at his story. And so, Sarah, I'm going to let you monitor the chat box for me.
Gladly, Terry. While we're waiting for comments to come in, we do have a question I'm happy to read for you if you're prepared to answer a question.
Sure.
Okay, great. So Heather asks, what happens if these stresses are not dealt with in a timely manner?
We get sick physically, we get fatigued mentally, we can erupt emotionally. So in the same way that we can bring balance by intentionally doing something positive in each of the 4 quadrants, if we don't pay attention, we're at risk of having these stresses add up to imbalances in all 4 quadrants.
Okay, well, we have some comments coming in now. Anna says, personal, secondary, personal, as well as current.
Mm-hmm.
Heather says, no stable home, family disconnect. Tiffany says, houseless, historical trauma, mental health. Yoshida says, Richard, personal, childhood trauma, historical trauma, bystander trauma, secondary. Natal says, the loss of his parents. And Fanny says, grief from the loss of his parents.
So one of the concepts that we covered just a few slides back was the notion that trauma can be complex. And sometimes it can be so complex that it's hard for us as helpers to begin to even sort back through it and to know even where to start. This can be a source of secondary trauma for helpers because we put as helpers tend to define our own well-being by being able to be helpful to others. And when we encounter something, like a situation that Richard's in, we can feel almost helpless to bring about help bring about change, and it adds a layer to the secondary trauma, where the all of the complexity just feels overwhelming. Do we have additional comments, Sarah?
Yes, we have a few more that have come in. Mary says personal childhood trauma. Susan says may have observed violence between parents, experienced substance abuse of parents, secondary trauma, intergenerational trauma, grief, to name a few. Deborah says intergenerational as well.
Okay.
And Erica says current and historical and secondary complex trauma.
Yeah. So it's you can people can see very well the kinds of trauma that are apparent in Richard's situation. But let's look at the last couple of lines here. Richard's counselor is an adult child of alcoholics, a survivor of abuse himself, and was recently cussed out and threatened by Richard. So what kinds of trauma is Richard's counselor dealing with at this point? Sarah, go ahead and read some that are coming in there.
Okay, we have several comments coming in that all say secondary trauma.
Okay.
And Kathleen says childhood abuse and trauma for the counselor.
Yeah. So even though we are experiencing secondary trauma by seeing this happen, if we have any of these issues in our own life, or we witnessed violence, or had the experience of being an adult child of alcoholics, these all carry with them the potential that we would react to stress and experience a stressful situation as traumatic rather than just stressful. So it's really important for us to pay attention as to what is not just what's going on and what we're seeing, but what is our own reaction to it, and then how do we plan for it? How do we get help? And of course, in this situation, it's really important for Richard's counselor to be talking to his supervisor and to be able to have a place to process, and perhaps even making sure that there's that he's spending time in his own therapeutic work to help resolve issues, because these are unchecked, unmitigated, unmanaged. This is a real formula for a toxic situation, either with coworkers in the workplace, or in his own family, or in his own health. So, Sarah, I think a couple of more things popped in. You want to read?
Absolutely. So, Nikika says secondary trauma and childhood abuse. Heather says Richard should have received therapy while he was in foster care for 6 years.
Yep. Yeah, unfortunately, we encounter a lot of people who should have had more services than they have received, and it leaves us in a very difficult position. Okay, well, we'll move on at this point. So I want to talk now about what are the strategies for preventing this secondary traumatic stress-related burnout. And I'm going to talk about 4 strategies: mindfulness, in what a technique called enhanced engagement. And I want to talk about our own cultural teachings from a variety of tribes, and then we're going to take a look at this notion of intentional resilience and how do we create an intentional resilience plan um, to be able to support the, our not only ourselves but other people in our environment and our workplace. This is uh, so first of all, many of you probably already practice some form of mindfulness. Mindfulness is a tradition out of Buddhist teachings, and you set aside some time and quiet space and get comfortable and um, allow your mind to focus on your thoughts. I've heard it said and read that we're the only creatures that have the ability to watch ourselves think. So if we observe the present moment as it is, and let your thoughts and judgments roll by, kind of like sitting back. And one once heard it described as sitting back and watching your own thoughts kind of on a movie screen inside your head. And if if we get caught up in the thoughts and begin to wander and we begin to think, then to return to observing the present moment just as it is, find it interesting, let go of the thoughts, and then keep returning to observing this. It's of how we're thinking, how we're feeling. It allows us to breathe. It helps ever so much if we get our control on our breath, because we're changing by engaging in the mindfulness and quieting our mind and taking that quiet observer role. Our body changes, the tension changes in our body. In order to practice mindfulness, we usually are needing, to get into a space that's quiet or comforting to the individual, so the context will change. And as I said, this is a practice that comes out of a spiritual tradition and has some healthy learned positive return, where it returns positive spiritual outcomes. So I encourage everyone to if you have an opportunity to learn more about mindfulness, take advantage of that, because it's one of the best strategies to think about to build your intentional resilience. And if you practice it, be kind to yourself. Our minds all wander, and simply come back to observing. The next item I want to share with you is Dr. Brian Miller. It's for supervisors primarily, but we can also use some of the concepts individually. It's called enhanced engagement. And in this model, a supervisor learns to recognize these different types of stresses and the potential trauma associated with them, and so makes a conscious effort to manage and mitigate the stresses. So if you're working in mental health setting or in child welfare, or and you're encountering situations that are not only traumatic for the people in it, but where you're constantly experiencing the secondary stress. From the workplace point of view, the supervisor can be very intentional about the way they engage this situation. And so it is first and foremost intentional. And you can do this as peers if it's not part of if you're not a supervisor, you can help your peers with this. So engaging the intense emotions, recognizing that when people experience adverse situations, whether the constant kind of stresses, or where they've witnessed or encountered a traumatic experience, that the intense emotions that come with that need to be recognized and labeled and engaged. And it doesn't mean that you dwell on it. You simply acknowledge how difficult and how impactful those emotions can be, asking people if they're getting help, do they have someone to talk to, labeling that these are very intense emotions that need help, and getting people, when I say limiting the dwelling on the trauma, talking about solutions rather than the awful thing that happened. Talking about how does someone get themselves back into balance. What are their current needs, and how do they get those needs met? And so that they're focused on the solution, not on repeating the traumatic thing that happened. One of the ways to help deal with people's ruminating or continually focusing on the trauma is to create a narrative, a story that makes sense of the trauma. This is like creating your own ending to a story. And I reminded when I was a child, if I had a nightmare, a bad dream, my mother would sit with me and help me make up an ending that resolved the bad dream. So you get to make up a narrative, to create a narrative of resolution. And this model helps engage the brain's capacity to create a narrative, to make sense of things that don't really make sense. And then reducing the emotional struggle, acknowledging that the feelings are intense and that you can sit with those intense emotions and simply let them be, because they will pass. And rather than fighting off or trying to hold off these things that are so difficult, to simply sit with them and let them be and acknowledge them. And finally, engaging in recovery activities. Spending time in nature, getting enough play. Play is a very therapeutic process for children and for adults. We play differently at different ages, but it's important to have time to engage in playful activity. And again, mindfulness or meditation is another opportunity to engage in recovery activities. Guy Wololatham from Warm Springs was worked for many years in the field of substance abuse treatment, and Guy was with us at NICWA for his graduate internship for a year. And while he was with us, he developed his model of strategies for supporting peers in the workplace. And again, this works for both supervisors or even administrators, but Guy was thinking about how do I help the people that I work with when I see them constantly under stress. And so his list is empowering people, making sure that people have problems that they can solve. Because when we're confronted by things that are too great to solve, it depletes our energy for helping other people. Making sure that people feel motivated or can feel innovative and inspired. This can be accomplished through working in teams, by praising someone's approach to a difficult situation, by recognizing that they're creating a solution that's people haven't thought about before. So recognizing other people's strengths are really important as well, and helping people come up with solutions that they might not have thought about before, and teaching intentional resilience. Guy worked with us around the relational worldview model and began to talk about this as being very intentional about building our capacity for resilience. So let me talk about some of our tribal teachings and why they are important to healing trauma and secondary traumatic stress. And these are just a list of a few of the things that are common across many different tribes. And they come out in different ways. I'm a member of the Seneca Nation, the Haudenosaunee traditions of the Longhouse, many different teachings. So we talk about the good message of Handsome Lake that includes many of these things. I know that in our Ojibwe peoples have the teachings of the seven grandfathers. And so wherever we go in the country, every tribe has has different teachings. So simply showing respect to other people. We have rituals to show gratitude. In our Seneca traditions, our greeting is Nyaweskano, and it means I thank the Creator to see that you are well. So we express gratitude to the Creator for somebody else's health and well-being. And it creates a kind of relationship that is not just between two people, but between two people and their Creator. We have rituals and for generosity, gifting, and when we give gifts to maintain proper relationships, to show respect and to show our gratitude, our connection with other people. We're taught humility. We're taught to not be better than other people, because part of the way that we maintain good relationships is to stay to not rise above other people, or to appear to try to rise above other people, to stay in that good relationship of common human connection. We're also taught to show courage, to express courage in the face of adversity. We're taught how to make loving connections. We use humor. We have been taught compassion for other people, taught forgiveness. Each of our tribes has ways of spirituality, even our participation in our cultures, time with our elders, and the medicines that each of our cultures, whether it's sage or sweetgrass or cedar or water or salt or whatever those medicines are that help us. These are things that we learn to do. And of course, our various ceremonies that help bring us back into balance. These are and um, and these are practiced as disciplines on an everyday basis. So, and they're the conceptual framework is to bring about balance rather than to treat illness. It's and in dialogue with some Western physicians, it's their concepts about dealing with adversity are so different, based in trying to stop something that's bad, so treating illness rather than creating health. So this list is, again, just representative. There are many, many more things that are part of our tribal traditions, and it's important for each of us to look at our own traditions to know what are those things that we should be practicing on an ongoing basis, um, to uh, maintain health and wellness. So in our Haudenosaunee traditions, we have the teachings of the good mind. And it's part of the teachings of the good mind is that we should be trying to understand what is good behind every action. It's not that we don't recognize things that are bad or adverse, but we try to find the health and well-being in the good and creative side of our experiences. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask the question: what can you think of? What I'd like each of you to jot down and use the chat box to talk about developing an intentional resilience plan. What environment reduces your stress level or is a healing environment? For me, walking or sitting near water is very healing. If I'm going to be in a stressful situation, it really helps me to spend time next to the water. What mental or emotional activities relieve stress for you? For many people, it's sacred songs or music of some kind. As I walk along, I have the opportunity to walk along the beach, the ocean. I'm often singing a song, and many times either something very playful or something very sacred. So what physical activity or foods or experiences relieve your stress? And finally, what spiritual activities relieve stress? So please think about those things and add a few comments to the chat box. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. Sarah, when you're ready. Oops, I'm going, there we go.
Sure. So we have one comment so far from Susan, who says, looking at the calm of the forest, yoga, dance, reading, being with my dogs. Natel says, walking/running, and just listening to all kinds of music from pop to country. Kristen says, environment, lake or beach. Activities, I struggle with this. I have a hard time turning down my thoughts. Physical/food, etc. Cream, pizza, walking, spiritual prayer. Deborah says, singing, being in glorious nature, ocean, feeling the wind on my face. Angela says, me too, walking, sitting near water, music, Epsom salt baths, dancing, getting quiet and grounded, creating herbal remedies. Violet says, for many people in my area, having the opportunity to walk through portages and sitting by a lake is very relaxing and spirit. David says, going out into the wilderness with family and friends is very healing for me. Denise says, walking and praying. Kathleen says, water or woods, playing music/yoga/friends, walks, nature is spiritual connection. Anita says, walking, praying, singing, and sitting in a quiet, calm place. Yoshika says, environmental, aromatherapy, and being in nature. Mental/emotional, having a safe person to talk to. Singing. Physical, walking, stretching, hot shower. Spiritual meditation, deep breathing. Mary says, walking, shopping, or sitting on the beach helps me reduce stress. Mental activities are listening to nature and spending time with family. Fanny says, listening to music, being a mommy to my 9-month-old son, prayer. Wendy says, prayer, quiet room, communicating with family. Heather says, listening to music, taking a walk, reading a good book. Says, environment, out in nature by water. Physical activity, creating something. I like to add practice bow drilling and striking fire, bracelets out of twine, and cooking. Nature is a spiritual connection for me. Yoshika says, enjoy time with family. Tiffany says, listening to birds chirping, my daughter, smelling the scent of summer sandy beaches and wind. And that's what we have so far. Thanks everyone for your comments.
Yes, thank you so much. These are all great strategies. I want to tell just a brief story. I was with a traditional teacher, elder, who was telling me about an experience he'd had with a Western clergy person who was traveling through their territory and this person wanted to learn about native spirituality, and he asked this gentleman, when do you pray, or how do you pray? And his response was, well, let's see, I wake up in the morning and I lie in my bed and I give thanks for the warmth that I feel and the fact that I've woken one more day, have one more day of life. He said, I put my feet on the floor and I smell the coffee brewing and I give thanks for the wonderful woman that I'm married to and for the taste of coffee that I know I'm going to enjoy in just a few minutes. He said, I pull on my robe and I start down the stairs and I think about the birds outside and I give thanks for them. And he goes on and on for several minutes, and finally the clergy said, I think I get it. So what this elder was saying was that his life was a perpetual, ongoing process of gratitude, of thinking about the things around him, and of acknowledging the things that he had been given. Um, this is it's these, these are ways of life. These are teachings that were given about how we should be in the world, and they tell us how to be. Sarah, I think we have a few more um, comments in the chat box.
Yes, we do. Nikika says, walking and cooking helps to reduce stress for me. I love being in a quiet place. My sister and I have created a grace to give to about 75 elders in our church, and we give out household supplies 3 times throughout the year. I also enjoy helping others. Angela says, beautiful story and daily practice.
And so that act of giving to other people, that is also healing and restoring. So I think, thank you for sharing that particular one. And finally, I think I'm going to wrap up with one more story. And in our Haudenosaunee traditions, that many of you have probably seen the corn husk doll, or we call her No Face. She has several names, actually. One of her names is Wahayenta, and Wahayenta means she knocks the dew off. Now, when she got that name because when she runs through the grass, she's short, only a few inches tall, and she knocks the dew off the grass. It makes her friend, the turtle, upset with her because he likes to drink the dew off of the grass, and she knocks it off. Anyway, Wahayenta went on an epic journey to find her face. She did that because she thought it would make children happier if she had a face. There's a whole part of the legend that's about how she lost her face. It's a little too long for me to tell in this context. But she has a relationship with an old man who made her. He's given the gift of being able to talk with cornhusk dolls, with no face dolls, and so she goes to see him because she's troubled that the girl who carries her didn't take care of her. She left her out in the rain, as a matter of fact. So he told her the story of how the no-face dolls lost their faces, and she says, "Is there a way?" Asks him if there's a way to get the faces back for all no-face dolls, and he tells her that that's a question beyond him, but he does know somebody that could help her, and he directs her to someone who's referred to in the story as Blind Maiden, and she lives in deep dark forest. So he tells her how to get there, and she goes and has quite a few adventures on the way. But when she gets there, the Blind Maiden conducts a ceremony to help her know what her journey will be and how to go about it. And as at the end of the ceremony, she's given several gifts. And one of the gifts that she's given is a black and white necklace, pearls, beads, black and white. And Wahayenta says to Blind Maiden, "Why are the beads black and white?" And Blind Maiden says, "Well, You're on your journey, you will meet people who will be good and who will help you. And you will meet people who are not good and they'll try to do harm to you. Said all of life is like this. All of life, there's good things and there's things that are they're hard and they're bad. And this necklace is to help you remember that you have to have the strength to get through those difficult times and to understand what when you're facing adversity. But you also need to remember and be grateful for all of those good things and all of those good people who will help you. Well, Wahayenta notices that there's one bead right in the middle of the necklace that's half black and half white. And she asked Blind Maiden, why is this one bead half black and half white? And Blind Maiden said, oh, that's because some of the things that start out looking bad will actually turn out pretty good. And some of the things that start out looking really good, they may turn out bad. And only your discernment will allow you to know which is which. And so one of the things that story teaches me is to expect adversity in our lives, but that we have what we need to cope. We have what we need to go forward. And so these are this remembrance that to use our discernment to always think about how do we understand the difficult things that are happening and how do we engage the positive things that we know are also part of life. So I'd encourage everyone to work on your personal resilience plan, to go beyond self-care, to having an intentional lifestyle built in cultural teachings that have been around and helpful for millennia, realizing that the more adverse things get, the more stressful things get, the more intentional we need to get about our resilience. And I see that we have many more comments in the. Sarah, do you want to?
Gladly. Genevieve says, listening to music, working out with Leslie Sanson DVD. Mary says, I have found massages to be helpful to relieve stress.
Ah.
And Yoshika agrees. Mary says, I cannot get one during this social distancing. And then we're getting a lot of thank yous for your story.
Well, great. I really appreciate being able to spend this time with you and to, it is so important at this time that we're all having this collective experience, that we're facing this adversity. And so many of the things that keep us in balance, like being with family or getting a massage or participating in our cultural events, these are on hold. They're not gone, they're just on hold. And so we have to be intentional about how we take care of our resilience, so that spending one time an elder told me to not be worried when we couldn't participate in ceremony. And he reminded me that all of the ceremonies, all of the cultural activities that we had came from someplace. It came because people asked for help and they asked for ways to heal. And he's told me that the spirits that gave people those things, that they haven't gone anyplace. They're still around. And they're just waiting to be asked. So I encourage people at this time of adversity to don't forget to ask for the good things that will sustain you now, because the same spiritual entities that gave us our medicines, that gave us our ceremonies, they're still hanging around waiting to be asked for help. So I'd encourage you to all make sure that you spend that time in gratitude for what we have, to remember that the difficult times will pass and that we can all ask for help in the same way that our ancestors did. Any last comments in the chat box?
We have some more thank yous coming in for you, Terry. And Genevieve asks if we're going to be getting certificates for this training, and I can answer that question. At this time, we're working on this process. There may be a delay, but due to the demand of certificates, we are working on a process for providing them. So thank you.
Great. Well, I believe that that's our program for today, and look forward to getting together again in the future. Sarah, do you have any closing business you need to do?
Thanks so much for asking. We don't, but we were going to be sending out a survey. If anyone's willing to take an evaluation shortly, we can go ahead and send that out through email. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for your work on helping us get all set up and being able to talk with people today.
My pleasure.
All right. Have a good one.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.